Read it and weep, the royal decree. This is another episode of Pr0totype, brought to you by me, Pronogo, and today we're going to be talking about Cosmonarchy, as usual. This is, of course, my solo design podcast where I talk about video games and stuff. Right now I'm working on Cosmonarchy, the future of the RTS made into a Brood War mod, which is essentially a whole new game built within that engine. It's pretty cool. If you haven't checked it out before, check it out now. I mean, just look at your screen. You can go Mass Hydra, but you also have other Zerg units that are pictured, and then there's a bunch of new Protoss units on that picture, and that picture was actually a screenshot taken by JujiK, one of our newer members. Welcome to the club, and I appreciate your contributions. Emphasis on the caw, because we got some crows here. On this episode of Pr0totype, we're going to be talking about the May Royal Invitational, as of right now, our most recent competitive tournament, and a bit of a recap thereof. I'll also be talking about some updates to CrownLink that just got rolled out right before I hit start recording on this show, which is pretty exciting. I'll be covering the Askosi, a little bit of gameplay musings for them. And I would also, of course, be absolutely silly if I did not round up some details related to the community in the Community Roundup. And of course, we close with coffee questions, because if you want to support project development and you want to help us homies out, definitely go to that link at the bottom left of your screen, in the description of the video, etc., and donate to us either one time or monthly. Monthly is, of course, preferred, and you get some nice perks, including access to super secret dev streams, one of which I did earlier today on the day of recording, so that's pretty epic. And yeah, there you go, a little bit of a shilling over. Sorry about the... I guess you could say the slower cadence to today's episode. It was supposed to come out earlier. I was supposed to record it on Tuesday. I'm now recording it in the evening of Thursday. And that is because I actually worked on my day shift, or I guess it's an evening shift, but it's my day job, if you will. I had to do a couple of shifts there back to back to back. And I did not work on Sunday, which I normally do, because that was a day that we had to tournament stuff. So instead, I worked on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and all of those days in a row. Listen, I don't need to talk to you guys about work. I'm sure a lot of you work 9 to 5s or whatever, but all those days in a row definitely left me strapped for time. So instead, I just did some general maintenance on the project, fixed some bugs, made some balance adjustments, and proposed some more changes to things like reclamation, and then did them. Proposed some changes to the Salamander and the Valkyrie and the Azazel, and who knows when we'll get around to doing those exactly, but hopefully later this week. And I was thinking about some stuff, and I was definitely thinking about some new units that'll be added to the Protoss arsenal, particularly the Xenolith, which is a new structure I want to add that will actually have dimensional recall. That's pretty exciting. So I've been cooking. I also recently started to reach out to some high-profile people within the RTS space, particularly as it is adjacent to Brood War. So hopefully we can get some more shows going on the No Frauds Club YouTube channel, where I do long-form interviews with influential individuals and people whose opinions I think are worth exploring. And it would be really cool to bring some people together and have some more talks in there. So stay tuned. And if you're on our Discord server, which you can join from a link in the description, you'll know a little bit about what I'm talking, because I always talk a little bit about what's going on there as far as guests for future episodes of the show and all that stuff. So definitely join us there. We got a pretty growing community. A lot of us are very active and playing, making content for, and enjoying the game that we're all talking about here, Cosmonarchy. So without further ado, let's move right in to the first proper topic of the day, which is, of course, the recap of the May Royal Invitational. Now, this event was exciting for me, mostly because we would get to see the debut of some of our more active, newer members. So for my money, the big four, if you will, that I was really keen on seeing were Krankendau, Ecalypso, Aud, as I came to find out was the pronunciation. I kept calling him EUD64, but Aud64, and Hit 'em Up. And so those four, in no particular order, but those four, were the ones that I was really interested in seeing. I did really want to see if we could maybe bring in somebody like Gerald Storm, who's been fairly active when he can be. He's a Zerg player. I was really keen on getting Top Ramen in there, who is a Terran player, and has been around for a little bit longer than those guys, and did technically make a debut back in Acropolis numero Uno. I almost said Dos, but that's coming later. That's coming in like July. And so yeah, he was in battlements, and he was qualified to battlements through the gauntlet phase. So obviously he's an established player at this point, and has only gotten better since his initial performance on the tournament stage. And so yeah, I feel like looking through that, it would have been great to have him. Unfortunately, he was not available. And I also wanted to get Pasarinho in, but I think he was working or he was busy or something on both of the days that we were having the tournament. So unfortunately, we couldn't wrangle that guy. But we did end up getting another newcomer that surprised everybody, Arbuz Budesh, who I have been educated on the pronunciation a little bit, and apparently whose name means "Do you want a watermelon?" or something like that. Great. Way back when I made a really funny comedic campaign sequence, and like in one of those missions, you had a unit voice acted by my younger brother. At that point, he must have been like 9 or 10, and one of his lines was, "My watermelon sense is tingling," and he just delivered everything exactly as I would want it to. It's sort of deadpanish, but it's mostly just like, yeah, of course, he just takes it at face value, right? And so there's some really good dialogue in that, and I thought it was really funny. And that's the first thing I think about when somebody mentions watermelon is my watermelon sense is tingling. Also, and sometimes when there's like a line for if you keep clicking on him, obviously we had those back then, and there's another line where he said, "I lost my watermelon." And, I told him to sound real sad, and he did. He pulled it off, dude. So it was good. But I did not, in fact, lose my watermelon this time around. In fact, Arbuz made sure to give us plenty. So it was cool to see him deploy. And it was really cool to see all the new guys in action, right? We had 4 returning names from Acropolis #1 as far as the throne room stage is concerned. And then we had 1 guy from Battlements, Jakulanski, and 1 guy from the Gauntlet that narrowly missed out on the Battlements, which was Benno, who actually switched to Zerg. And I think I am going to, not because of Benno, but, I should say not just because of Benno, but in general, I think it's probably good if you're one of these players that's not like a throne room caliber player, or maybe put another way, if I haven't seen your performance as one of the races, as the race that you're trying to sign up as, I probably am not going to allow you to switch your race from that, because I think Benno's Protoss could have actually been pretty legit. Maybe he would have taken a game off of the Shambler, or maybe even Neblime, who's very new to Protoss relative to the other races, and had swapped into Protoss for this tournament. I feel like maybe then Benno would have had a better thing to show for himself. But I was like, oh yeah, sure, Benno, you can change your race. And then, he happened to have some very unfortunate performances in the tournament. And, actually one of the games was very close. It was like a Dirty Rush kind of game. And then there was another game where I think he held his own okay. It was just like everything was a little bit too bad. But then there were a couple of other matches that he played where it felt like it was very clear that he was new to the race. And that's fine to be new to the race, but not in the context of like, hey, I'm expecting you to do some things, I want you to put your best foot forward. So just for everybody involved, the people watching, myself, and of course the player who's actually playing, it's probably good if we stick to like a certain element of, you qualified based on your play with this race. That's how I gave you the invite. I probably am not going to keep you, give you the invite again, or preserve you the invite, I guess is a better way to put it. Cause like, it's not like I'm not going to invite Benno to another tournament in the future. It's more like, if he decides to change his race, it has to be to something that I've seen him play at enough to know that he's good enough for whatever level. And if it's like one of those open sign-up tournaments that's designed to be like, hey, you're actually, this is an underclass tournament, then Benno can sign up as whatever race he wants, and everybody can sign up as whatever race they want, because then the performance part isn't that big of a deal. But I felt like that was one example, and there were a couple of examples before that too, where people would just like suddenly pivot their race. And actually, you know what? I was a little bit nervous about Hamster going to random because I had never seen his Terran from a competitive standpoint. And actually, he was okay as Terran, but that was another thing that like maybe it would have been better for performance's sake and for like the tournament's sake had we enforced what they had initially signed up as, because he had initially signed up as Protoss. But you know what? I think in the random case, maybe I'm a little bit more biased because I like that thing. If Benno had decided to be random, I thought, the 2 out of 3 chances he plays at a race that he's more comfortable with, and Zerg is the odd one out, whereas Terran was the odd one out for Hamster. And maybe that's like a little bit more exciting and more of a spectacle or something. I don't really know, but I thought that was fine to point out. But besides that, though, and besides the one match that did have a little bit of a tech issue, which was actually related to Hamster's internet, as far as we can tell, We actually had the tournament run without any issues, and we had some very cool games in all of the groups. In fact, not a single player won their group without dropping a map. And it was really interesting that that was the scoreline for the first placers. It was always 4-1, no matter which group it was. It was always 4-1. And so, I don't know, there's something about that that's pretty competitive. Art of Turtle was more competitive than his scoreline suggests. Some very close games, some games where he was maybe a little bit unlucky. And you know what? In an isolated environment, I almost wonder if it wouldn't be better to increase the number of games that you need to play to win from 4 to, say, 5, which would obviously mean that we would go on for another rotation. And maybe that means we would need more maps. We do have a lot of maps in the Empire class pool now. But maybe it also would just mean that after the map pool is fully processed, it loops back over itself again. And we play, we start on Maxium again. And then from there, people pick or whatever. It could be that. It could also be that we just add a lot of maps. The one concern with adding a lot of maps is that if the maps themselves have significant differences associated with them that are maybe harder to get a feel for on the fly, and you have newer players or players who haven't played on those maps that much, then that might be something where it's like, oh man, that's actually kind of hard. How are you going to get people to learn all these new maps when they're also learning 50 units? But maybe that's something that we think about and experiment with when it comes to the format. And the reason I say that is because it does, after 4 games, having somebody be a winner can feel like maybe I didn't really get a chance to settle in, and maybe, I only had to, I could have prepared 2 cheeses for each matchup and then I'm good, in theory. So I don't know, there's something about it where if I wanted this to be a bit more of a preparation tournament, well, for one, we would want to announce the groups a little bit ahead of time. And for another, we might want to make it so that there are more matches required. And that would be fine, in my opinion. That would be fine. I also think that we're at that stage where pretty soon we can think about making a tournament that instead of being a King of the Hill style tournament, the way that this battlement system has gone for Acropolis, that we also had for the March Invitationals and the May Invitational now, I think it could be pretty cool to, instead of that, do a bracket where it's like, I just seed everybody based on what I've seen so far. We play out a series of best of 3s or best of 5s or whatever we decide to do. It would probably be best of 5s if I had to guess. It's double elimination. And yeah, we just do that. It's just a straight up double elimination best of 5 bracket. And then the final would be best of 7. And we would just play that out. Now, the problem there is that based on availability, you would maybe still want the format of having, I guess what you would do is you would sort for groups in the same way where you would still have a set number of players playing. And so maybe it would be you would say, okay, I'm going to schedule the matches to be played where we have side of the bracket number 1 and side bracket, bracket sequence phase number 1, bracket phase number 2. And each one of those phases would be, played at a different time. And that would be the scheduling part. And that way we would confirm that okay, say if we have 4 names in each phase, and it's Aud's Terran, Hit 'em Up's Protoss, Krankendow's Zerg, and I don't know, we'll throw Hamster's Protoss in there for good measure or something like that. And then we know the opening matchups based on the seeding would probably be something like, I don't even know what it would be like exactly, but we would imagine it's it's Aud versus Hamster and Hit 'em Up versus Krankendow. That's the first setup, right? And then the winner of each match plays each other in a best of 5 and then proceeds further to face off against the winner of other phases. And then the loser of the first 2 matches plays each other, and the loser of that match would be out of the tournament, but the winner of that match would go on to play the loser of the upper bracket match, which would in this case, say, imagine it's Aud and Hit 'em Up win their matches. They go on and face each other, and Hit 'em Up wins, and then Aud faces the winner of the losers previously, which would be Krankendow versus Hamster, and say it's Hamster who wins. I'm sorry, Krankendow, you're probably the only one out of all these guys who's even going to listen to this show, but in this hypothetical element, just imagine that they played really good games and or abused things like Reclamation and Madrigals. Yeah, there you go. That's how they did it. And I don't know how... oh, yeah, no, that would make sense, I guess, if you were facing off against Aud and then you faced off against him again. That would make sense. It's God damn it, this guy got me with Terran OP, tank drop bullshit, write a comment, etc. Now, if that's the case, then Aud would move on and he would face the first place out of another group. Or no, I guess he wouldn't, right? Like, would we reseed at this point? Maybe we would reseed from that point onward, in which case he would face off against that, and that's how we would do that. So basically, each phase would simply be like 4-team group almost, but it's like done through that best of 5 bracket style play instead of the King of the Hill style, where you play everybody in a best of 1 until somebody has 4 wins, which is what it is now. I think that could be kind of interesting. But anyway, if you guys would be down for more wild tournament formats like that, let me know. If you guys got your own ideas for formats, also let me know. We have a whole tournaments channel on the Discord server where you can talk about that stuff. But you can also, of course, leave a comment on this very video and tell me what you think. I think it could be pretty cool. I also got to say, though, that the games in this tournament, the May Royal Invitational, were really cool. I think the format is not a problem. It's more just like the format is something where maybe we could be more experimental with or try a different looking tournament at some point. And it would be super easy to quickly set up, maybe like I can do that for visualization purposes. And we can do something like, say we have, for example, 2 phases to it as a demonstration. So now that we're looking at the Bracket HQ site for the ease of me just pointing it out here, imagine this is sort of like the matchups here, and like the top 4 players are going to be the players who, I guess these would be like phase 1, and then phase 2 would be down here, right? And so phase 1, we have the 4 players we mentioned, and then phase 2 has the 4 players that we mentioned here. And so they would face off against each other. Now the difference here is that, yeah, I guess the reseeding would happen here. So this is basically like the throne room stage in a way, except we're starting off there based on our seeding. And the seeding isn't the number next to the player in this case, because we're kind of like having each half of the bracket exist on its own. So imagining a world where these 4 players could play at this time for the first set, and then these 4 players could play at this time. And by the way, like we would eventually add, more players or whatever, and then we would have like 4 sides of it. And so this side would be, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. Like that would eventually happen too. And so that's something to think about. But anyway, that could be pretty cool to imagine a format like that, where it's straight up best of 5s throughout the whole way. And yeah, hopefully that sort of illustrates the concept a little bit better. It's just something that would be an alternative format that I think could be pretty cool. The concern I would have is that maybe it drags on a lot, but especially with more players, that would definitely happen. But we could at least set, like, okay, we know which players are active in which phase of the tournament. So we just find a time to schedule where, okay, you have like this, say a couple hours scheduled aside to put up for this. So let's all play at that time, right? And so we would know that like, since Aoud and Hamster and Krankendow and Hit 'em Up play against each other, okay, you guys have to set up at like, say we play the Aoud versus Hamster first, and then we play Crank versus Hit 'em Up second. That makes sense, right? But in order to make this work with scheduling, we would also want to make sure that all 4 of the players have like, say 2 hours set aside, because after this opening best of 5, they're still going to play another game. It would be right after. So say Aoud beats Hamster and Hit 'em Up beats Krankendow, then they fight immediately. And then that second match would be played between them, but also the losers match, which would be down here, would be, say, it would be in this case Hamster versus Krankendow. And so that would always happen, right? Like the first 4 matches of a particular phase would be played at the same time. Then we would play the first 4 of the next phase in like another day. And you could see how this could work out a little bit differently. It's just there's a lot more to play for past that point. So it's a little concerning. But I'm always somebody who dreams big, so I like myself some crazy formats. All right. Yeah, games were really nice. I really liked that Arbuz Budesh against Hit 'em Up game. That was really hype. There were some really good picks elsewhere, too. Of particular note, for my money, was actually, there were 2 really cool games between Krankendow and Eclipso. One of them was on Starshore and Sepulcher. That's the one that's really easy to recommend because it goes 30 minutes. But maybe the more interesting one is actually the one on Blackwater Bastion, because it's a little bit more straightforward and yet still like the way that was won. It was the victory was achieved through like positioning and stuff, in my opinion. I think that's kind of interesting. Whereas the Starshore and Sepulcher one, maybe Crank was a little bit more like he was just charging forward a lot. into the same angle. And so maybe when you're watching that, you're like, wait, when does Crank just take his advantage? And he's like kind of arriving at that a little bit slow. But he does eventually do some serious damage, and Eclipso makes some really good holds. So that's pretty cool in and of itself. Obviously, it's a very long game, so it's hard for me to talk about more of it without spoiling the outcome, but it's definitely a banger. You should definitely take a look at that if you've somehow missed it. Going into Group B, the best games were obviously the ones between Nebelheim and the Shambler. There was a really cool, tight one between Benno and Nebelheim on Fata Morgana. People keep saying, oh, bully that map, get it out of there, what are you doing? But, I mean, listen, the cheeses and the ridiculousness of it, it's its own sort of show. Like, I so want to include that map in the next underclass tournament as well, because like, just imagine the crazy stuff that can happen, right? And I think honestly the game in Group A on Fata Morgana was kind of interesting too. It was Art of Turtle versus Eclipso. There were storm drops everywhere. I feel like it was a game that that's a kind of matchup that, okay, like if assuming players decide not to aggressively cheese each other, then the game actually, I think the map is fully functional. Like, it doesn't seem like a map that's just ready to be destroyed in terms of the gameplay. So I think it's like, yeah, it poses an option for people to do that sort of crazy thing. But I almost wonder if that's overplayed, and if people just decided to not do that because maybe it's too high variance, or it's expected, like it's coming around to that, oh, you picked Fata Morgana against me, or it's this map. I'm going to expect you to do something crazy, so I'll do something conservative. And, you know, I guess you could try to use that to your advantage. But it's really easy to move from conservative to normal, and it's a lot harder to move from crazy to normal, if you know what I mean. So that generally tends to be what happens. I think that's interesting anyway. So I don't actually think it's a bad map. Of course, sometimes Nebelheim does listen to these. Maybe he can explain why he doesn't agree with me. But I feel like there's definitely a lot of room for that map, which is indeed a map by Veek7, by the way, to be able to stay within the Empire class map pool forevermore. I mean, will anybody ever make a better map than that? I don't know. We also had some really nice matches in the second day. By the way, Oblivion delivered between Nebelheim and the Shambler, in my opinion. I played that against Daryl Storm recently as well. It's a map that's very interesting, I think. There's like a couple of details there that are... I just like the flow of it, generally speaking, between like once you get to multi-base gameplay, the decision of when to take which base should you take as your third? There are two possible options, and which base to take as your fourth heavily depends on which base you take as your third. So I don't know. I like the fact that there's a flow chart, but the flow chart has many prongs to it. It's not a very simple, like, did you take this, then take that. It's more like, if you take this, then you have this option as in addition to the other obvious one. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. And it's got really very nice wallable stuff by the natural. So that's pretty cool too. I haven't mathed it out. I don't know if you can, as Protoss, because like there's this double Larvosk all-in build that Shambler's talking about, that he thinks that Zergs will just die to that or a 6-pool. And if they die to the 6-pool, it's because they tried to wall. And if they die to the double Larvosk all-in, it's because they didn't wall. I don't know if you can wall before the 6-pool on Oblivion, but it seems like a map that it could be possible for that. It's just super easy to wall, so I wonder about that. I know that Genesis Y, another map that's new to the map pool for Empire class, is also a map where I think walling is made a little bit easier, but I haven't tested too many configurations yet, so I don't know. It's interesting to think about. I guess somebody will have to test that out. And then, it was Oblivion's debut. It was all the 4-spawn map debuts, right? Starshorn, Blackwater, Paradise, and... there was another 4-spawn map that I'm blanking on the name of. Maxium, of course. How could I forget it? So it was pretty cool to see those in the tournament play. I feel like those delivered some interesting games. Obviously, the highlight from Group C is Paradise between Arbuz and Hit 'em Up. It's just a ridiculous match. Both versions, including the one that broke and we had to replay on Blackwater, were actually pretty interesting. And then I'm trying to think about... Group D was mostly the Paradise between the Night Fox and Aoud. There is an interesting game on Starshorn between the Night Fox and Jackie Langsky. At least it starts out kind of interesting. I am blanking a little bit on exactly how it ended. I think it was just an economic advantage, but something that is worth taking a look at regardless. But yeah, I would say definitely the memorable one was Paradise, the Night Fox versus Aoud. That was a really cool game. And yeah, so there you go. A little bit of some matches to take a look at. Obviously, if you look at the Cosmonauts Compass, I actually recap the event and talk about some highlight matches and link to the timestamp and stuff. So you guys can check that out if you want to. Those are always linked in the description of these videos. It's our weekly text and image based devlog, so you can check that out as well. All right, now that we're done with talking about May Royal Invitational, let's cover CrownLink real quick. It has received two-fold separate updates. They're very, very cool. I will go ahead and pull up the notes now so that I don't screw something up. But Jesse, aka Juniper, has been hard at work alongside Veek7 to just bring us that better version of basically like a replacement for Radmin. It's just better networking, it's lower latency, etc. So the super duper official change log from Jesse says, resolved many, many crashes caused by non-thread safe execution. That's mostly when you're in the lobby, but there should also be some resolution for in-game stuff as well. I don't think there are any more in-game things. Added status string at the top of games lists to show when CrownLink isn't connected. This basically means that when you jump in, and for some reason, if like the server's down or your connection isn't working or you're offline or whatever, it will simply it'll say like trying to connect, basically, something like that, and it'll just be like that forever. And that way you're not confused when there's no game lobby there. Game lobbies now always show, even if P2P, which is peer-to-peer, couldn't be established. This means that for some reason, if you're not able to connect to another person, but they are on the server, you'll at least see their lobby, and that way you'll be able to report information. Again, basically stopping you from saying, I don't see any lobbies, if there are actually lobbies. You'll always see lobbies, even if you can't connect to them, essentially, is the cliff notes there. Initial turn relaying support. Relaying is used if peer-to-peer couldn't be established. And there's some notes about how latency will be slightly worse, but still better than VPN latency. Relayed lobbies will have an R tag, which is in brackets at the beginning of the lobby name. And relaying essentially works for things like phone hotspots and stuff like that. So again, it will be worse than pure peer-to-peer, but it's required for certain things, depending on your carrier, depending on where you're getting your internet from. It might also be the case for like if you're in a Starbucks or some other hotel lobby, like some public Wi-Fi, you might have to use relaying, and that way it will work there as well. Maybe we should use something other than R for this, because people might assume that that means, oh, you're on release and I'm on pre-release, but it doesn't. I don't know. We'll have to think about that. By the way, there is another feature where it says !ver, which is obviously VER. That's telling you that the version is mismatched and somebody has to update or change version or whatever. There's another note here. Reconnect code now automatically rebuilds peer-to-peer if the connection was lost, and elaborates about how if you lose connection, you might be able to reconnect. It's not going to cover all situations, but most of the time it should be able to recover as long as the other guy doesn't drop you. So that will help reestablish connection in cases like what we saw on with Hamster, where he almost disconnected, but not quite. Because of his internet, basically it will match that level of power, if not better, which is pretty cool. And then there's some code cleanup for performance and stability. So pretty, always nice to include that, but pretty basic for the end user. So there you have it. Some exciting developments. I am always pleased with more progress on CrownLink, and I think it's definitely going to end up being just way better than anything else that we had. So definitely download that. There will be links in the Discord server. So if you're an active player, you can get access to it earlier than everybody else. If you're on our Discord server, you can get access to it earlier than the people who just download it from ModDB or whatever. But eventually it will be distributed via the fraud launcher. You will, of course, have to update the fraud launcher at some point, but that's beside the point. And yeah, keep tabs on that. Stay glued to the screens, so to speak. I don't know, just watch this space. I'll post an update video when it's officially out there. So towards the end of the last podcast that I recorded, I mentioned that I wanted to do some work on talking about the Askosi in the same way that some of our donator questions lately have been referencing races and regencies from Xibalba, which is my bespoke sci-fi RTS slash video game general setting that I've been working on for some years now. And I realized that I haven't really done that kind of thing publicly for the Askosi and explained how I perceive and imagine players will be using them. And the Askosi are inspired by in my opinion, it's like the the feeling that you can get by using certain units in other RTS titles, like the Dawn of War Space Marines that have the jetpacks, the Jump Marines or whatever they're called. They're not called that, but something like that, where they have the jump packs and they can kind of leap into battle and stuff. There's certain like visual and general thematics that I want to achieve, not in the sense of they're going to be heavily armored, because they're mostly going to be lithe, lightly armored, very mobile. The Askosi infantry, anyway, the biotic Askosi. And that is going to be a deliberate move away from that kind of like heavy armor thing, because that's supposed to be more of a Terran thing. Terran bio, even though it has mobility with Stimpack and, especially if you pair it with Trojans and stuff, is kind of meant to be a little bit more about like stand and fight, use your reclamation to raise the dead, healing to preserve the living, and in fact the dead as well. And that sort of thing, right? And so the Askosi are ideally going to be able to relocate and constantly be on the move when they are attacking with biotic units. And they're actually going to use the mechanized ones in a different element. And, that's where the frontline reassembly cornerstone comes into play, where they essentially have a second life to a lot of their heavy vehicles. And this is to kind of offset the more mobile options that they have from the biotic branch. So you can imagine using predominantly biotic units, using predominantly mechanized units, and then mixing and matching. And usually I like the idea that mixing and matching ends up being better, but there is always an allure to sticking with the one branch as well for a little bit of time. It's less expensive to establish a baseline for your military production. It requires less juggling with the UI and less configuration with your base layout. You simplify what you're actually doing, and you know what your expectations are, and so on and so forth. And those are the kinds of things that when you're going through all of the motions of playing an RTS game, you're going to start a little bit more on the simple side, and you're going to build your way up with an understanding of what these units do for each other. And so you can imagine, okay, the biotic branch has all of these mobile units and they can jump around and stuff. Another unit that I think is kind of interesting thematically is the Terran Reaper from StarCraft 2. It goes without saying that unit has significantly mutated the way that the game has evolved, and that if the Reaper didn't exist and was instead replaced by some other mobile infantry unit for scouting and other such details, that maybe the game would be completely different. The maps wouldn't all have special needs jump spots and stuff like that, where it's only for this one unit, and so on and so forth, right? So it's really weird as a unit, and I don't like how it was delivered upon. But the thematic of being able to jump up cliffs is interesting. The thematic of being able to move a lot, move very fast, recon, I think there's something compelling about that. The only time you're ever really a threat is against certain enemy compositions when you yourself are in mass, in numbers that are I guess you could say unorthodox, which is not to say that I want to make a unit that's only useful in the first moments of the game and then afterwards you don't look at because it's not, cost efficient anymore. It's more to say, there's going to be some units that, their purpose is very obvious when you initially acquire them. And then there are ways that you can give them new purposes. In fact, the whole idea of finding a new purpose for existing material is a very obvious thematic for the Askosi. And so trying to key that into some of their cornerstones and some of their lore is going to be a fun. I don't even know if it's going to be a challenge per se, but it's going to be a fun task for me to accomplish, and a fun sort of like bullet point on the Askosi itself is the way that they find it. Like the thing about the Zerg and them like using corpses for spawning frontline units, and how that like gives new life in a funny way to the purpose of the Zethrakor and other spammable units. Think about the Terrans and how, early on their chaff, the bio is not necessarily the most useful, but if you can start raising them over and over again, then they can be way more useful actually. That's the kind of thing that I think is pretty interesting about the way that the Reclamation Cornerstone interacts with some of the units that maybe you otherwise wouldn't necessarily look at too much. But it's this force multiplier. It's this thing that allows them to be more powerful, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, basically using the Cornerstones to give additional life to the units is a very cool way to achieve scaling power, where initially this unit is useful, and then maybe it starts to fall off a little bit, but you can acquire another unit that is useful unto itself, but also allows another use of this existing unit. Or you can choose to pivot away from that option entirely into something that doesn't have a reliance or a synergy with previous units and instead kind of exists on its own so that you can then find something that synergizes with that. And that's sort of like your decision to, do you fully leave behind what came before, or do you connectively, have some sort of connective tissue with what came before? That's one of the main ideas about the way that you scale up your composition and scale up your general tech acquisitions in Cosmonarchy. That's one of the main ways to accomplish that. And I think that's cool. So what is the Askosi game plan when you first start out? A lot of the times you're going to want to scout with the biotic infantry that you can get from the radix, which is your very first structure. Again, I'm going to have to look at that again and say, is it radix? Is it radix? I actually don't know. But it makes, currently it's slated to make 3 different units, the proselyte, the cardinal, and some unit that I have not fully conceptualized yet. But the proselyte is the one that can jump to allies, and allies includes neutral structures. It includes structures in general, I should say. It does not include air units. There will be a flyer that can jump to air units. Or not a flyer that can do it, a biotic unit that can do it. There's definitely going to be some sort of relocation that can interact with air units. One of the things that I was definitely thinking about is how this concept of a biotic unit jumping to an ally to reposition is going to be something that I think, another sort of connective tissue that I can make is when you play, if you've ever played League of Legends and you've ever played as support, you can sometimes play Braum, and he is a champion that can jump to an ally. And when he does so, he can bring with him his projectile intercepting shield. And that's a very simple way. He also does a small buff to himself and to the ally that he jumps to. And so that's okay, this guy can be fairly mobile. He can apply crowd control with his other abilities and stuff, and he can also intercept projectiles using this feature. And so that is all built into his kit, and it's pretty interesting in isolation. Again, just like the Reaper, I think there's things about everything in League of Legends that is just, it's not necessarily executed perfectly. And that's a very non-controversial thing to say. And now you can't even play it if you're self-respecting because you have... Vanguard XD. But I will say about this particular example that there is something that's satisfying about leaping to the rescue of an ally. And that's something that I would love to have as, again, a cornerstone, a thought behind the Askosi. They're in this together. They're more than the sum of their parts, even on an individual basis. But the way that they express that is through their collaboration, their cooperation. And so that's how they team build. That's why they have this sort of system where, oh, you thought you destroyed my mech unit, but actually it's just going to, jettison its capacity for mobility, and it's going to sit here, and it's going to be an anchor, not the Terran anchor, not the garrison, but an anchor in the sense of, at this point, I will be here for a while. I have more defensibility. Maybe my weaponry is deactivated, or maybe my passive is deactivated, or something else is different about me in addition to not being able to move. But think about what the biotics can do. They can jump to allies. Think about what other biotic units might be able to do, right? Just like we've taken, for example, the Terran, the idea of a polyoid adhesive, and we've taken it away from just only being something that the Hurakan has as a passive and made it so that every fire-based attack basically has this behavior. That is sort of like what I'm talking about, right? And the way in which that you apply this, yeah, the Hurakan applies it with a cone that can, or a sort of line trace that can deal some damage, and it's like a melee attack. But then the Matador is something that has to deploy itself to immobilize in order to use its flamethrower, and that's very different. That's very different than the Hurakan, where it can kind of attack and then move back and attack, whereas the Matador doesn't have that luxury. And then you think about the Striga, where it is a melee unit that knocks people back that attack it from a melee range into the fire that it's also attacking them with. It can attack air units, although it's pretty short range and it's kind of unlikely to happen. But thematically, the way that it attacks is a little bit different as well. It projects the fire forward a bit differently than the Hurakan does. And then you think about the Salamander leaving the fire field on the ground, and how that is a damage over time thing that sort of sticks to the ground and then applies the stack. And isn't that a very different way of doing it? You're basically doing a polyoid adhesive area denial. And very different, right? Very different. So I wanted to bring that up as well as another thing, because that's another example of this sort of idea. That's another example of going through and saying, we're going to have this single aspect, but we're going to echo it, and not simply echo it, but maybe refract it in a different way, because now it's leveraged through a different mechanism. It's leveraged through a unit which deploys in order to access that weapon. The Durandal is one that I didn't mention, but it's a melee unit that actually has like a ranged attack that can fire while moving, and it's more durable, and so that emerges as like a later game unit. I was actually thinking recently, like, what if the Durandal was Titanic? It can walk over other units, but I'm not going to do that. But that was like a cool idea that I had too. And yeah, so like there's different units that interact with it in a different way. And in that case, it's actually very simple, because it's basically just saying, yeah, when this unit attacks with this weapon, it applies this effect. It's very simple in all cases. But the weapons and the unit itself, they all have different characteristics that make it so that the way that you interface with this passive, the way that you interface with this mechanic is very different, right? And so I think that's really cool. And the way that we would have the interlocking mechanisms cornerstone, which is the combatants that can work together to do certain things, combine assets to achieve unique goals. You think about cybernetic supremacy, which is what gives them the ability to leap and charge, switch places, navigate the battlefield quickly. Relocation and disruption abilities. Like, some of that stuff is a little bit vaguely worded right now. It's not exactly grounded in the concepts that are publicly available. But the proselyte being able to jump to an ally, that's the baseline. That's the, Hurakan flamethrower version of the cornerstone. And what comes next? What comes after that? Maybe it's summoning an ally to it by, using some kind of ability that basically makes it so that this unit, like I target a unit, and then when they're within range of me, they can jump to me somehow, or I can reactivate it to make them jump to me. And then it doesn't have to be a unit that even has the jump to begin with. There could be a heavy unit later on that moves quite slowly, but can jump to an ally. And so you could imagine a world where you're, able to try to jump to an ally, like this unit that's like normally quite slow can like jump up a cliff or something. That was an idea floated by Vika actually a while back. I'm not sure it would work for mech units, because they're not really meant to have the jumping part. That's a kind of a biotic specific cornerstone. But the idea of being able to relocate in general, yeah, sure. Why couldn't you have a vehicle that does sort of like that call to arms kind of thing, where it picks an area and says, yeah, all units can, force all units to jump to me or something somehow. Maybe there could be one that instead of jumping, or doing something related to allies, it repulses enemies. It makes them jump somewhere, or it summons an enemy to them, pulls an enemy to them. Maybe it jumps to an enemy instead of an ally. Like, there's things that we can change up here that still make it very distinct to the way that the Askosi work, but are echoes of the original design that you first see in the very first unit that you make out of them, out of their production structures. So that's like how they're going to gather information. If you send your pilgrim, which is your stock worker, out into scouting the enemy base, you can have a proselyte that immediately jumps up a cliff to join the worker and takes a shortcut or whatever. You can try to build a proxy, totem of some kind that they can jump to as well, which you could imagine just like based on that alone. Okay, yeah, of course. I'm gonna be able to jump to this thing, and then that thing will be able to be like a ward, almost like ward hopping as Lee Sin in League or something like that, right? Just like thinking about different things that you can do just with the jump ability alone. So, scouting can turn into raiding pretty fast. Unscouted proxies can be more punishing than, in some certain ways, more punishing than in when the other races do it. And in other ways, they're less powerful because they're not proxying like an Acantor or a Dracodin or whatever. They're proxying, just the ability to jump up a cliff, right? And so that's a little bit different. But yeah, these are absolutely things that you could think about and say, oh, that's very interesting, right? Like, that's not something that you normally see. Neutral anchors that you can jump to and then immediately garrison, that comes to mind. That's one of the, neutral anchors are a feature on certain maps, then the Askosi would be able to use them in that way. That could be very interesting. Just the fact that you have to start thinking about that in a different way, and the fact that that's a uniquely Askosi thing, I think is going to be quite satisfying. And seeing how that scales up over time is also going to be satisfying. But the whole idea of my vehicles deploy into more defensive versions of themselves when they take fatal damage, essentially giving them a second life, sort of like how the Vagrant has a second life, but in a way that instead of giving them more mobility like the Vagrant has, it gives them less, it gives them none. But they can be reactivated. So it's not a permanent thing, and they're not taking damage during that. So it's not like a timed life thing where you don't have that much time to work with. It's a question of, how aggressive is your enemy being and what is your enemy doing? Are they going to focus it down or not? There's going to be some vehicles that do better in terms of combat when they're in their second phase, which is actually quite interesting because you could imagine deliberately walking your tank, your heavy, tank over with the idea that like, okay, right now it's firing conventional rounds. When it switches into its second phase, it will start zapping things in an AoE with lightning because the Askosi do a lot of lightning stuff. And so that's like a case where it's like, oh shit, you got to watch out for, when I kill this, I need to either focus it down or disengage. And being able to do that, maybe you deliberately path that into the enemy's natural and by their workers. And it's like, I dare you to fucking send me into my next phase, dude. Like, good luck. And so these are the kinds of things that you can do. And you factor in the idea that these things essentially serve as these anchor points that you can jump to with your other infantry. And if you jump there with, units that can then hold the ground long enough for your other relocation specialists to join up and be able to summon other units to join them, it can get out of hand very quick. The reinforcements can be very fast. The combat disruption can be quite noticeable. And so like a well executed attack from Askosi will involve a lot of their abilities, but not in the sense of like, oh, I'm casting this ability that deals damage to the enemy. It's more like you're really taking advantage of the mobility that you can have, even though it takes a little bit more APM. A lot of the decision making that you do before is going to be before the fight when you're just working through the concept of jumping on to the enemy or jumping towards your ally or whatever. And it's like, okay, I'm going to set up my army so that my units attack from this angle and that angle. And you're kind of like setting up before the fight and then pulling the trigger. And based on your setup, that's going to give you more or less time to actually make these adjustments in the middle of the match. So very exciting to start working on the actual units pretty soon. I'm really looking forward to that. Really looking forward to bringing you guys along with that. So some of those streams will, of course, be public. If I can't guarantee all of them will, some of them will probably be donator specific. Maybe like my first time playing through like the, just in the, fucking around in the test map or playing an AI game where I play as like a very limited version of the Askosi. That might be something I put into the donator stuff or whatever. As Fagudo once said, paywalling hype. But it's very cool. And I mean, just listen, obviously they're going to be all over the screenshots for like future prototypes and the ModDB page and shit like that when we're getting to the point where we can actually deploy them. And so you expect to see like me taking a screenshot of like the town center and the worker when those are done and being like, Pog Fraud Champ, the first sign of the Askosi is here and stuff like that. That's very soon, actually. That's very soon. So looking forward to seeing you guys for that. And that pretty much does it. Let's go into the community roundup. So as usual, I like to start off the community roundups by welcoming new players from the last week. We have, of course, very important to welcome Owner. He is a guy who has been gaming for a little bit now, and he's been playing Cosmonarchy. He's joined the United States Cosmonarchs, so he's already got a clan affiliation. Classic move, great stuff. We had Arbuz Budesh, of course, join us. He was, of course, debuting his skills and his ecclesiast predilection over on the Royal Invitational. And so that was very cool. We welcome back Scarlet. We see a guy named Mar Saruman, who's pretty funny. Illusion, who's actually a guy who's commented a little bit on some of the playoffs VODs, the Throne Room VODs for Acropolis #1. So welcome, sir. I don't know if he'll end up watching this or not. And we had a couple of other people pop in. But I haven't seen them actually say anything yet, so I will wait before I formally greet them. But of course, everybody is welcome, even if you're going to go ahead and lurk somewhat silently. And now I get to do the very exciting thing about looking through the maps. So first up, we have Genesis Y, which is a map by Biddy B. This is modeled after Blitz Y, but it obviously makes some very distinct changes here. This is not the first time I have talked about this map. I think this might be the first time I'm showing it, though, because back in the day, I used to do these community roundups without actually showing the screen. I feel like it's pretty obvious to just do that, so now we have that tech. Spawns are in the top right and the bottom right. And I think the changes to this map most recently to, open up the middle a little bit, conserve flow throughout the middle of the map in general, adjust the top left and the bottom left bases a little bit as well. I feel like all that stuff is good. These vestry graphics are actually biotic bastions, so they are a little bit beefier than vestries. Technically, you could probably reclaim these or take these by building a iron foundry somewhere, but it would basically wall you off, and the odds of it staying alive that long are pretty slim. I don't know if we'll end up preserving these, but they do obviously help with walling. That's really the only reason they're there. And it's obviously just modeled after, again, Blitz Y, which doesn't have this exact configuration. It has like a left-facing ramp instead of like a cardinal direction ramp. And so that is obviously a little bit different. But I thought it was worth taking a look at this map just because it is now available. I did put it in Empire class. I think it has a lot of potential. Of course, we will see if I'm correct in that. Based on people's feedback and all that stuff. So play it, give your feedback, and maybe Bitty B will be able to make additional changes. But I do think all the changes that he did make were pretty positive. I'm not sure about this thing in the middle over here. It definitely shapes a lot of the engagements, but without it, it might be a little bit too open versus the third, if that is indeed going to be your third's position. In general, this map is a little bit, again, I still think it might be a little bit cramped, and this is something I remember saying when I first looked at it. But I do, again, think that the improvements have been nice. We'll also take a look at another map that was improved. This is Dyadic Shore. The lines here are to indicate things that were specifically changed. Red is just the removal of the back ramp. If you didn't play this map back then, it had a second ramp. The purple down here, or pinkish color, magenta, if you will, is actually adding unbuildable tiles to above this ramp so that it's not something that you can take and hold very easily as any of the races, but particularly Zerg. Nebline was doing this a lot. I think Terran could probably take it very easily. Maybe, I think sometimes Hepseo would do it as well with Protoss. There's a little bit of a reduction in the unbuildable and unwalkable tiles around the blue circle, and then green is just like a small aesthetic change that slightly increases build space in the main. And that is that. I'm not sure how to feel about this map. I guess I just need to see more games on it. It is still in the, this version of it, I believe, is indeed in the Uprising folder. If not, I will fix that. But you can download this version. Oh, you'll get it automatically if you use the Fraud Launcher too. And you can check it out in the Uprising folder. Pretty cool stuff. And so there you have it. Now we get to talk about Oblivion. Now, Oblivion is pretty cool. Obviously, it's a map that I had some nice things to say about it when I was talking about it earlier, but we do see a couple of changes here. So anywhere where there's green in these two spots, basically opened up the mobility of this area slightly. The blue lines are just to indicate that visually the crevices have been moved a little bit. That should make it easier to line up your town centers. And the white is to indicate that the mains have been pulled down a little bit, so that there's a little bit more room for building structures behind the mineral lines for defense and stuff, in case units actually end up getting over there somehow. And I guess I could see a world where they fly over your natural, but it seems a little unlikely. But anyway, if that does happen, it's a little bit more defensible. So pretty simple stuff there, but definitely check this one out. It is also an Empire class map. It's pretty cool. Now, I do have a couple of maps to take a look at, but new ones, that is. But first, we'll take a look at Paradise. Paradise has received 2 changes, count them 2. Of course, the opening up of this cliff near the naturals. You'll notice that it's no longer there. The significance of that is pretty high because it means that air harassment will be less effective. You open up more build space behind here. You can even hide tech over here or something in certain spawn configurations. Definitely some cool stuff. It might make it a little bit easier for Zerg to get Warden rushed or something, but that hasn't been a problem yet, so I don't know if it will. And then over here, the third has been made a little bit more defensible with the presence of this cliff. So ground armies cannot attack it super easily. That should increase the amount of playable times that we see, like Zerg versus any other matchup, any other race in particular. But also, I think Terran versus Protoss, this hurts Protoss a little bit, and probably hurt the Terran slightly as well if the Terran was even with the Protoss, because the ground armies would just be able to swarm the base. So, I don't know if this particular change is actually necessary, but I don't think the map is worse for it. I just don't know if it's actually going to change anything. We will find out, of course. And I gotta say, for the new maps, the only person we can even talk about is JuGK. They've been making a number of maps. This is a 4-spawn Ashworld map. This is actually going to be my first time properly taking a look at this map, so it's going to be kind of interesting. We spawn on the top left, top right, and bottom left. And these spawns are pretty obvious, where you've got your main, down the double ramp into your natural, and then from your natural, I guess you could pick between the 12 and 6 locations as your third, but your most logical third is probably going to be over here. Now, if this is a vertical spawn configuration, this third is very easily harassed by air, dropped, sniped, etc. It does look like over here there might be some walkable tiles. At some point, I really just need to go into the tile set and make it so that this is not like an actual walkable thing. But despite that, and besides that, I feel like this is a pretty... this is probably fine. You might even be able to hold this in most matchups, but I do think that, for example, if Terran is on one side, they can probably park phalanxes here and just barely attack workers. But that might not be true. Maybe, in fact, looking at it a little bit closer, that might be incorrect. But you generally want to watch out for the phalanx. It's not like I can get cliff advantage. It can drop on this. I know this for a fact. Again, maybe that shouldn't be the case on a tile set level, but it's probably also not the end of the world if you get there. Maybe. I don't actually know. We'll need to see if somebody actually abuses that or not. But yeah, in theory, on vertical spawns, you could also just go to 12 o'clock and take the other spawn, the other spawn on your hemisphere, so to speak. The double gas bases and the interior 12 and 6 are kind of interesting. You can obviously harass the resources with artillery from the center, and that makes controlling the center pretty helpful even in the late game. But I think in the mid game, I don't know, there could be some interesting aspects to this. This kind of reminds me, because of the very blocky layout that it has, it's very similar to Nitro Valley. I don't know how flow would look on this map. I think map flow is a concern for me right now, just looking at it, which is kind of a vague, amorphous concept, but it's basically like, when I'm moving from point to point on the map, does it feel satisfying? And does it feel like I'm making smart decisions? I'm able to make smart decisions about where I put my army and how I migrate them. So I can only say it's a concern right now. I can't even really pinpoint exactly why. I think there's something about the map that feels somewhat repetitive as you move around. That's kind of something that you're always going to have on maps of this relative size, which if I take a look... By the way, the map's name is Scoria Apotamos. Check that one out. But that map is 4096 by 4096, which I think is 128 by 128 in terms of if you divide that by 32. I guess we can do that really quickly. And so, yes, it is. So that's how you get the map size from the file dimensions, if you didn't know, the image dimensions. But yeah, Scoria Apotamos, interesting map. I should throw it into Uprising. I don't think I did that yet as of the time of recording. Check it out, play some games, see what you think. There's another 1v1 map that is Twilight. It's also by GGK. It is, what is this? Thalassa's Claim, I believe. Yep, that's right. And this one is also going to be 128 by 128, if you're curious about the map size. We have spawns in the cross configuration, top right, bottom left. You know what? It's so funny, but even though these are completely different bases in the top left and top right or bottom right corners, it's very interesting to me how the first thing I thought of was Terminus, a really old map that I made. I don't even know if Neblime played on Terminus. I know Mystery Meat played a lot on Terminus because that was like one of the better maps back in the day. I used to play against him a lot. Back before we even had like units spawn on the side of where your rally is and stuff. I remember him setting up a Zergling trap, so to speak, outside of my fulcrum, killing my vulture. It was very traumatic. That wasn't what caused me to add that. Veek added that at some point. And we had some very funny moments where I was playing against Mesk, and Veek had just added that feature, and a unit couldn't find a spot to spawn, so it spawned in 0-0, which was the top left of the map. So that was really good. And I was like, how do I have a Maverick up here? Oh, man. That should come back for April Fool's, I think, because Veek was observing that match, and he thought it was hilarious. So anyway, the air base is obviously in the top left, bottom right. The natural is pretty obvious. I actually think it might be really hard to take a third on this map. I guess maybe you're supposed to take the Basilica bases, which are at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock-ish. I don't know, though. I guess if you take 12-6, then maybe that's still defensible. It's pretty far, but in theory, it's defensible. The extra avenue of coming from the bridge seems really important, the bridge that leads into the airbase and the top left, bottom right. But that bridge, to me, also is kind of awkward because it opens up yet another angle that you have to worry about if you're taking 12 or 6 as your third base. And there's already like 3 angles that you got to worry about. So I guess, I don't know, it's kind of weird. It's like if you can get to 4 bases on this map, you're probably great. But the going the intermediate step between 2 bases and 4 bases is going to be where a lot of players die. If I can just predict that into the future, Lisan Al Gaib style, that's what my level of prescience is telling me. I know this is probably really minor, but the fact that this ridge is all the way over here, for some reason, that's really triggering me. I don't know why. But hey, you know what? There are aspects of this map that are very interesting, like the fact that the middle, including the upper middle and lower middle, are kind of very open, but the sides are a little bit more closed off. It's really interesting from a sort of level. I almost wonder if it's not worth it to like recede the water slightly. Maybe in this area specifically, to the left of the interior 12 and to the right of the interior 6, and basically say like, yeah, even more ground mobility to come into this area, right? So that this whole middle, it's like a slanted rectangle going top right-ish to bottom left-ish, if you will, a slight diagonal. But that whole area is supposed to be like super open, is almost like the vibe I get. And then if you were to move units through, like there's something about that I think would be really satisfying. And then obviously you can try to like choke this up even more from a balance / tweaking point. That could be very interesting. And imagining like, oh yeah, I can't really get over there and I can't really get over here. So like these bases are a little bit safer from ground harassment. But the whole middle of the map is like a lot of posturing for ground army. That could be very interesting to explore from a gameplay standpoint. So despite my concerns about your ability to take a third base, I think big army fights should be really exciting on this map, actually. And so maybe those minor changes that I was saying about like receding this water a little bit, maybe receding this dirt cliff a bit, and then obviously the corollary is down here, receding this groundwater area a little bit and this cliff a little bit, just so that more bigger armies can make their way through. Might be something to think about. I would definitely think about adding yet another water block over here, just like one extra water tile over here. So whether you recede the other one or not, pushing this one a little bit further down and a little bit further up in the top left case, just making it so that it's a little bit harder to fit large ground armies over here, might be worth doing. I guess you can just tell players to wall it. I think this is an unbuildable doodad. I'm not sure. I might have made it buildable in Cosmonarchy. I know it's unbuildable in the default game. That doesn't say much, though. A lot of stuff is unbuildable. But that's Thalas's Claim. Check that out as well in the Uprising folder for 1 versus 1. And that brings us to a very interesting map called Area 52. This is already, I can tell you, there's going to be some very interesting games played on this map. This map is GGK's offering for Fraudarchy. So this is a 2v2v2v2, and it is indeed on the Badlands tile set. You can see you have some very cute little Omni ramps-ish going over here. They're not the full surround because those tiles don't exist yet. You can see the Titan Forge for those blends, but they're not spectacular. I don't know if recolors have been used on this map, but this map feels like to me it would be really cool if you could have the nighttime version on. There's a lot of interesting situations over here. Okay, so since it is a two teams to a spawn, you've got the gas base, you've got down here natural third, I guess. They're a little bit far from the mains. And then this would be natural third, except the third like forces you to fight with those guys up there. So that's kind of interesting that you're kind of like there's segments to the map. I'll take a look at the map size here. So actually it doesn't really look like it's that big. Let's crunch the numbers. So it is 6114 divided by 32, which is about 192. Yeah. I think I did the wrong number there. 4608 divided by 32. So it's 192 by 144. It's actually quite small for an 8-spawn map. Very interesting as a choice. So this is going to be a bloody, I'm going to just come in here and attack. I don't know. That's going to be really cool, I think. That's going to be really cool. Again, when it's a team game, FFA game, you don't care as much if the map is balanced. I mean, team games, you probably do. FFA specifically, though, even if it's a team FFA, you probably don't mind too much if there's like some IMBA thing or like a thing where it's like, oh, that's not super competitive or whatever. Then nah, fuck up, dude. It's an FFA. Just have fun. So that's probably the vibe. But yeah, this is really cool, actually. I really like the way that this one looks like it'll shake up. Lots of build space in the midsection. By the way, this is a crucible, not a random whatever the robotics facility was called for a brief time before it got removed. I think it technically was in the game for a brief period of time as the synthetic cyanide way back like years and years ago before we got a custom graphic for that via 5 Nations placeholder asset, of course. But That is indeed the Crucible. I can just tell you without even looking. Why else would there be that structure there? There's not even a pylon to power it if it's not a Crucible. So it is a Crucible, and that means that you can speed up your production of certain units if you put structures there. And so that could be really interesting. Okay, guys, that is very cool. I am down to see some games on this map. I hope you guys are too. And that more or less comes to the end of the community roundup. I am excited to see what kind of crazy shenanigans we get up to. Let's go on to the ever vigilant coffee questions asked by our ever vigilant coffee men. Okay, our first question is from Myrian. And the question I chose, he actually posed 3 different ones, but I chose the one where he was asking about the Sycora. He wanted a gameplay preview of the Sycora as they advance in tech, as well as the general aesthetics and appearances of the Regency's infantry, vehicles, and structures. And alongside that, so like this was one question, but it's 3 questions. How do they view the various natives and the other cosmic immigrants of the Xibalba universe? Well, slow your roll there, sir. I would spend a lot of time if I was going to answer all of those. Let's first and foremost bring in the Regency's page so I can refresh my memory a little bit here. But obviously the Sycora are the ones that come from another dimension and are not shy about saying so. It's maybe thought or assumed or theorized that some of the other ones do, like the Kolopoazos, the Catithrons, but the Sycora are just like, no, yeah, we come from another dimension. And we're specifically here to harvest resources to help us with our war back in our dimension where we are, really quite, our existence is quite dire. And so when they come into our realm, they actually are incomplete in some way. They leave behind a whole dimension of their existence in their back in their home, basically, back in the heart worlds, as they're called. And so the Sycora arrive in the fights of Xibalba, and they should look a little incomplete, actually. I don't exactly know how yet I will do that, but I was almost thinking about like how in 3D modeling terms, you can get some really weird texturing issues if you have like back faces where the normal maps are, or the normals of your mesh are like flipped in some way, and so like they're not properly there, or there's like missing faces. I know Myrian will appreciate this because he's been working with Blender lately, so he may have run into these kinds of issues or discussions of them, and so he should be familiar with that part anyway. But yeah, you know, like there's all sorts of weird texturing stuff that can occur when you're basically looking at a model, but like part of it is missing. Or if you can take a complete mesh, like say a cube, and you can select one face of it in Blender and you can hide it and get the same effect is what I'm talking about, or an effect that would be comparable anyway. And so that's the kind of vibe that maybe I would like to experiment with the Sycora, especially the earlier stages of them where it's like, it's harder for them to manifest completely. So the Sycora, as far as their gameplay is concerned, I'll go a little bit high level here. They are actually planned to have structures that upgrade, production structures that upgrade themselves. And the thinking process behind this was initially that maybe when you get access to, so your basic infantry production structure is called the martyrium, which is, something that trains martyrs, right? So that kind of makes sense. There's also the clerisy, which is something that trains vehicles or produces vehicles, right? And so you can gain access to those two initially from the word go. You also, when you tier up by constructing an intrusion, which is a tech center, you can upgrade your martyriums into reliquaries, which is a tier 2 martyr branch production structure, which you can think of as like bio, basically. And then there's the schism, which is a new, like a completely different branch that is a new structure you make. So the clerisy at this stage does not have an upgrade. But when you get the lay bear, which is another tech center, the idea behind the lay bear is that will give you access to the testament, which is the tier 2, or I guess in this case tier 3 clerisy. It's the upgraded clerisy. And that is additional better vehicle production. And then there's the falsehood, which is the upgraded schism. So at this tier, there is no reliquary upgrade, right? And so that's sort of like they take turns introducing upgrades or new production structures or whatever. And that's, in my opinion, I think that's pretty cool as a way to do it, so that as you tech up and as you change tech, you gain access to different things. Now, I'm kind of not sure what the progression would look like for, like, would you have to build martyriums and then upgrade them? And that would be the way that you would do this even at like tier 10 or whatever the final tier would be. Like, are you really going to go through and do all of this upgrading every time you construct a new factory, that seems really awkward for scaling. And I would say that, yeah, that's absolutely the case. So what would probably happen is that once you achieve tier 2, the reliquary would just be constructed from the worker. And that, I don't know, like, the other thing to think about, though, is that maybe the martyrium should be something that you can construct. If you want to spam out basic martyrs, even at the later tiers, that should be something that you can do. Because currently the martyr branch, the reliquary just gives you 4 different units. So when you upgrade it, you actually lose access to the originals. So each structure was planned to give you 4 units on average. So maybe this will be something that changes in the future. Maybe it'll be like the martyrium gives you access to less units than 4 initially. And then when you upgrade the reliquary, you get access to, say it's like 3 and 3. So you get access to 6 total units from the reliquary. But then like maybe if you upgrade to the next tier, you lose access to the martyrium units, but you keep the reliquary ones. And then you get access to another set. I'm not sure how that progression would work off the top of my head. I know that the idea of just losing access to the original tier is kind of weird, but that also justifies having to build the martyrium from the ground up. But maybe you would just be able to warp in a reliquary, or in this case, I'm thinking warp in because it's advanced, but it's not actually how they would do it, right? They're not really warping stuff in. They would intrude with their reliquary from the word go if they wanted to, right? So that could be kind of interesting. Now, the manifest is what actually, that's their town center. The manifest is what brings forth the production. It's what actually creates the production. So they make stuff out of their structures, and you just need vision, active vision of the area. And so Sycoran units and structures provide the build space. You just need to have active vision. That makes vision, like a vision range, sight range, kind of an important resource early on. I was thinking that the workers for the Sycora will actually, the basic worker will have pretty low vision range actually. And then the advanced worker would have something that's a little bit more. And then, you know, you're not going to have to like babysit your structure where if you lose active vision on it, it doesn't produce any further until you gain active vision of the construction site. But maybe it could be something like that where it actually affects the construction speed. Like if you don't have active vision of it with any other units or structures that are made, you don't get like maybe it comes in at 75% base speed or something, right? So like you lose a quarter of your construction rate or something like that, which could also help with like abetting proxies and stuff, obviously. But I think that could be kind of interesting to think about. But there's a lot of documentation about the Sycora actually on their tech map. So that's something that you can access from the Xibalba webpage, which I always end up linking in the description whenever I talk about this, which has been all of the most recent ones. But there's definitely some interesting ideas in there. I really like the Cortalis, which is a vehicle that you can get out of the Clerisy that has this. It's sort of it basically is like a riff on the Adept from StarCraft 2, how it has the shade that it can do. So the Cortalis has something called Splendid Shift, where as long as its shields hold, Cortalises can initiate teleportation to any site within 8 range. And so it's not like they create a thing that moves there. They just designate their fallback position, basically. And that shift takes 2 seconds to complete. And so during those 2 seconds, they can freely move and attack during the channel. But if they lose all their shields, the shift is canceled. And so you can only really do this when you're like, you know, you might want to do this as you're like planning to scout or something. So like, I'm going to scout up and see, and I have 70 shields, so that's a lot of shields, but that's definitely a tough case. Now, the other thing too is that their passive gives them a 5 shield restore to their shields every time every second attack. But every second attack also will deal half damage, and they only deal 12 damage, by the way. So they're going to do 12 damage and then 6 damage, but heal for 5 shields, and then 12 damage and then 6 damage, but heal for 5 shields. And that kind of rotation aspect is kind of interesting to me. Plus, combine that with the Splendid Shift. I just think that's like a unit concept that I could implement now without using shields as like the benefactor, but instead being energy or something. I don't know. I could do something about that concept now in Cosmonarchy, and that could be a really cool unit. So that's like something that I look at and I think, oh, that's really cool, actually. So anyway, there's some things about the Sycora that are like that. But going back to the question briefly, obviously we have explain a little bit of how they advance in tech. The general aesthetics is something I didn't talk about. So that is like, I did talk a little bit about the aesthetics, about like some traits that they would have. Their vehicles are going to be very sharp and like overly so, ideally, where they're going to be made up of kind of like simple geometry, but like really harsh, jagged edges here and there. Not in a sense where they look like needlessly edgy or like I don't want them to look like dark and demeaning. The color scheme will be fairly bright, actually. I'm thinking a lot of reds and purples off the top of my head, but that might change. And by reds, I'm not even thinking about like evil reds. I'm thinking about like faded red almost. Like something like again, trying to hint at the idea that they're not able to show their full brilliance. And maybe the intensity of their colors would increase the higher the tech goes, right? To indicate that they're able to manifest more and more of themselves in the area, the higher their tech is achieved, which would be a key detail for the Sycora, actually. And then for the, they kind of mix their fighters and vehicles and infantry in a couple of different locations, actually. But like they have like a shield medic sort of unit called the Kitoros, and that's supposed to be an infantry unit, but it's actually made from the clerisy. So what they're, it's just kind of interesting. They don't have like a vehicle branch per se or a bio branch per se. Even the martyr branch, which I mistakenly called bio earlier, is actually like, yeah, there's a lot of infantry, but there's also like your first structure gives you access to the Odaira, which is it's actually supposed to be a fighter, like a small, it's like a vassal type unit in a way, but like a little bit more powerful. So that's kind of interesting. Oh yeah, I remember there's the Ewinata, which has the passive object permanence. And I really like this unit. This unit is, when they strike a target, so by default they have 6 range. When they first attack a target, they are free to attack the marked victim from any range. And the projectile speed is slow enough that that the debuff could fall off on really, really high ranges. But that's something that I think is really cool to think about. Like, oh, I as long as I maintain vision of you, then I can attack you. And so I just need to make the initial hit, and then I can maybe teleport backwards. Now, if you imagine you apply what we talked about with the Askosi, like maybe that splendid shift behavior is something that you can target a group of allies and then target a terrain, and then it gives them splendid shift. And like after 3 or 4 or 5 seconds or whatever, they teleport away. And now you combine that with the Ewinatas to achieve like an attack onto, say, the enemy town center, and then you're starting to put pressure on them from much farther away. And it requires some execution. You're going to be revealed when you attack, so it's not purely safe. Yeah, there's definitely some balance implications there, but I think it's really cool to think about that sort of thing. It's like the call and response and like the different things that you can combine together and stuff. So yeah, that's definitely some pretty cool stuff. But yeah, I really want the Sycora to feel like they belong somewhere else. And part of that is going to be to construct them out of seemingly primitive geometry, while also very clearly having some stuff that's missing and not quite right. I haven't really solidified that, but that is definitely like the broad stroke idea that I have for their visual design. And how do they view the various natives and cosmic immigrants of the Zabalba universe? As competition. That's the simplest way I can put it. They know that resources are very vital. There is generally an agreed upon idea that you don't go blowing up entire planets, even though you have the tech to do so, because resources are finite, even though the galaxy is vast and the cosmos is vast. The Sycora tend to try to be very selective about like, we're going to go into here because not that many regencies are and nations and etc. Not that many powers in this universe are even aware that there's resources here, but there's always some. There's always one. Very rarely will you be tasked with doing an operation in some place that has been not mapped out at all. And so the Sycora actually do dispatch scouts to try to find areas that are completely uninhabited and then make them not uninhabited. But eventually the Sycora intrusions will be detected and so on and so forth. And that's just something that you have to worry about. Like, okay, by starting to gather these resources, we're kind of, publicating and broadcasting our presence, and, we can't go undetected forever. And so, yeah, obviously that means that people are going to know that we exist, and that's scary. That's spooky. And it's true. It is spooky. So it's something to think about. But, yeah, with all that said, I think they're very like they don't like the idea of talking too much with the other guys. They don't like the idea of forging alliances. They're very, very paranoid and worried and stressed out in many ways because of the fact that they have this conflict going on back at home. They take their duties very seriously. They're also not operating at 100% because they literally are missing parts of themselves. And so, an aspect of themselves is not actually present. And so they only try to serve for a short amount of time. So you're not going to get pure Sycora. You're never going to get the 100% that they could provide, unfortunately, because you're never going to be in their dimension, right? But they can maybe project it a little bit here and there with some of their more powerful units, and they're the ones that I wanted to basically be able to like nullify terrain, like just create a total like null zone around certain areas and make it so that that terrain just doesn't exist anymore. Actually, texture not found. World space error, something like that. So there you go. A gameplay preview of the Sycora along with a bunch of other details about them. Hope you enjoyed that question, sir. Appreciate your support. Now, 3Crow asks the next question, and it's in the same kind of format, except he's just talking about the early, mid, and late game, but he's asking about the Gatamemtr. Can you discuss what the early, mid, and late game of the Gatamemtr will be like? So Gatamemtr is a super intelligence, and as the tagline says, with good intentions, in air quotes, it tries to basically be a museum in some ways. It tries to safeguard all unique matter in the universe. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't, like, no two elements of Gatamemtr are the same. That's not quite true, because it recognizes that there is something to be gained by having, something that's mass producible, something that is, repeatable, etc. And you gain organization and you gain efficiency and predictability behind that. But there are certain aspects of Gatamemtr that I would like to lean into in the sort of specialist front that would actually be something that would be completely unique. I just don't know exactly how I would achieve that. It might be something that instead of being completely unique, like literally every game the unit is different or something, because we have like Borderlands levels of permutations on your guns so like no two guns are going to be quite the same, although I think that's also overblown, by the way. Borderlands is pretty bad, but it's not like that necessarily. I guess I would probably think about a more achievable system for Gatamemtr would be like you can simply customize them pretty well. And so that customization would be bespoke to based on what you're fighting. I think at this point, Gatamemtr has assumed aspects of every single regency in the game. And so when you fight against a regency, say you're in a 1v1 against Sycora, since we were just got through talking about them, Gatamemtr would probably be able to pre-equip or pre-submit a list of options to itself for selection. And the idea behind those options would basically be, like, in some ways I talked about the Resellium some podcasts ago, about how they should be able to, like, you could use the control nodes, the Carousel, you could basically use them to dictate changes across, basically, like, it would be like accessing upgrades almost to your units. But it would be like a configuration plan, and when you choose it, you can't go back, and it's like a one and done thing. Now, I don't know if Gatamemtr would be something you could go back on, or if it would also be one and done, but my concept for Gatamemtr would be something like, based on battle data that you gather, and based on maybe some recommendations from Gatamemtr, you'd be able to essentially itemize your army in such a way that would provide you with something good, not in a hard counter sense, but good versus the general composition that you're up against. And the flexibility there is good because obviously you're going to have FFAs and you're going to have team games and all this other stuff in Xibalba's RTS game. So it makes sense for Gatamemtr to be able to do something a little bit more flexible than simply, oh yeah, you're up against Keltar, or you're up against Sycora, or you're up against Resellium, so you should do this. It's more like, oh, you're up against units that have this characteristic a lot because that's what they're building. Well, maybe you consider this. That would more so be Gatamemtr's style. Whereas I think the Carousel would be limited to, so they would have less options overall, but they would still be able to optimize the Resellium a little bit. Gatamemtr would be more like live gathering data based on what you're doing. And so that would be a bit more like combat-driven tech progression in some way, which I think could be kind of interesting. The Keltar have that as well, but it's very different. It's not something that where they are upgrading or changing aspects of their tech tree in terms of like what they already have. Whereas maybe Gatamemtr would simply evolve forward based on that, and it would simply drive changes to its organs, its various cells, that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think that's really cool. Even the text for Gatamemtr's description is like, once a creature becomes Gatamemtr, their neurology undergoes rapid change. And you know, like just the fact that the idea of like writing that anyway is pretty cool. And yeah, the like Gatamemtr basically exerts will across all of the organs, all of the cells, all of the aspects that it has. It isn't like spreading a biological thing per se. It's likely organic. It's also able to modify technology, and it's also able to, you know, reprogram Rosellium and stuff like this. And so the fact that it's able to do that via, you know, its vast amounts of ability to control things is clearly like, it's not exactly, even if it is organic or even if it is not organic, it doesn't necessarily matter because it's doing something on a molecular level, on a maybe a nanite style level or something that makes it so that it can seize control of and eventually subsume the entirety of organics, obviously mechanics as well, mechanicals and stuff like that. So it's pretty potent. I think its early game would definitely be about essentially probing, seeing what it's up against, doing a lot of reconnoitering. When you scout like a unique unit ID, you know, that the enemy builds, that would be probably something that's towards your progression, which kind of implies like, oh yeah, he cares about unique things, right? Or I say he sometimes, but it cares about unique things, right? That makes sense. So that would definitely be points towards that. Scouting-based tech progression sounds exciting to me. And so like, you know, in team games, Gatamemtr would be the guy to scout all the time. Of course, you'd always want your Gatamemtr player to scout. That makes sense. So I like that idea. And then so after gathering enough info, you can optimize and customize your tech tree a little bit based on what you've seen. But you're always continuing to learn. You're always continuing to gather data. So this would be like, you would essentially have like, you know, there's like something called a boom bust cycle, right? And Gatamemtr would kind of follow something like that, where they have like an information gathering phase and then okay, let's act on our information phase and kind of go back and forth. And like, while you're acting on your information, you're also gathering more information. So that's helpful. And all of this other stuff. So, yeah, that's pretty legit. That's pretty legit in my opinion. Also, I just had a heart attack because obviously I've been talking about Gatamemtr this whole time. And, I thought for sure that I typoed something in my notes because it said Githroven, but that was actually one of the options that Myrian went for that I didn't take. So I got very concerned that I just talked about Gatamemtr when 3Crow actually asked for Githroven. Even if he had asked for Githroven, maybe at that point he still would have been happy because I at least gave him Gatamemtr. That would have been really funny. Like, actually, let me just answer this question completely wrong in a way that this is what I wanted to talk about. But yeah, obviously, once you start hitting that mid-game timing is when you'd start having your control seizure units, being able to just steal enemies, probably subsume them, that sort of stuff. And that would probably give you, you know, like some significant stat changes to those units, but also the ability to, I was thinking you'd be able to remake units that you steal. So depending on what you actually invest time into doing, you would be able to do that. And so I don't know if there would be some limit to that. Like, I feel like there should be some kind of limit to that, but that's not a concept for a gameplay system that easily lends itself to being limited. Would it be like the last 5 things you steal can be made? Well, then maybe it's not super easy to control that. I think maybe it would instead be more like from a list of everything that you have seized so far, you can equip this structure with the ability to train 3 of them. And it would be like a specialty structure that you make specifically for that purpose. And somehow the things that you stole would be displayable so that you could see which units could come out of that structure, so that as an enemy you could choose to prioritize destroying that. And I'm not sure if retrofitting and reconfiguring that structure would be possible, but I think it should probably be possible. Maybe it would just be a time cost and not a resource cost to do so, where doing so would basically lock it off from being able to produce anything. Or at least there would be a time before it could produce the unit that you're trying to get to equip it to produce. during which you could produce other units that it still has active equips on or something like that, right? That's probably what I would go for if, off the top of the head. As like an idea, spitballing that idea. I feel like that's pretty cool. So yeah, I mean, Gatamemtr starts off with its own set of organs, but the idea is that it gathers information about what else it needs, and that's how it progresses in tech. And then it also steals the enemy's tech deliberately so that it can make more of it itself. And so I think that's actually really cool. There would probably be some stuff to steal enemy structures later on, and you'd have to decide, do you want like their defensive capabilities or their ability to produce certain units, or what? Like, what do you exactly want? That would be something to explore for the late game, or maybe like the late mid game, if that makes any sense, or the early late game. I'm not sure, but there you go, 3Crow. That is an answer to your question, and I hope you enjoyed. Now, going on to Lucifirius's question, he asks, what other incarnations of Ackmed are there? Ackmek, Ackmedic. And it's true. What other incarnations of Ackmed are there? I suppose this is a good time as any to explain that Ackmed is basically this, he's kind of like an unintentional demigod, or maybe unintentional deity, where there exists a chicken pile at the end of the universe, and there's an Ackmed eating that chicken pile. And at the end of the chicken pile, when that Ackmed finishes eating that chicken pile, he then turns into a new chicken pile, and a new Ackmed arrives to eat that chicken pile. And this is the engine behind the universe, in a way. And so it's something that must be preserved, lest we eventually succumb to entropy. And so Ackmed is a very important character, but unfortunately for him, or maybe fortunately, or maybe it doesn't really matter, he has not really been able to preserve much of his memory. You know, having so many existences where you exist as you're every single Firebat, you're every single Hurakan, you're every single Heracles, you're every single Durandal pilot, you're obviously every single time that there's a flamethrower in like another game that's not even an RTS, like anytime there's a flamethrower type character, like a flame trooper, pyro in TF2 or anything like that, that's Ackmed. And so having so many existences is actually quite debilitating for Ackmed. He's obviously every Firebat hero or Hurakan hero. His favorite pro player is Firebat hero, stuff like that, right? And so these are like important details about Ackmed that you got to know if you want to know about Ackmed. And so knowing that Ackmed has so many existences, it's easy to understand why he doesn't remember that he's a deity. And he just kind of goes through the motions and follows his gut. And a lot of that time, he is led to chicken. And so, by the way, the chicken is internally called Micken. Micken is actually because Ackmed went on a very memorable Ackmed adventure to an alternate dimension where there were mutant midgets, sort of like... this is before Borderlands, so I swear I didn't get inspired by that. But this is sort of like Mad Max style in a way, where there's this really fucked up area where there's all these mutant midgets. And Ackmed just wants to fry them up, cook them up, and turn them into Micken, midget chicken. And so that is where Micken comes from. And so that was something that I made back in like 2011, I think, is when I first started that, or maybe 2010. And so that's a really old setup of like really weird slapstick humor almost. And so, yeah, that's what he's actually eating. It's not just chicken, it's Micken. And so, yeah, we all love Micken around here. And so that is what Ackmed is all about. What other Ackmed incarnations? Now you know every single Ackmed incarnation. It's anything with a flamethrower. I haven't heard about Ackmedic before, though. That is a new one. Probably because I've renamed Medic to Cleric. I never really thought about that connection. But it's worth noting that maybe... I mean, technically, in one of the Toddborn projects from way back, I had the... what do you call it? The... I'm forgetting the name of it. It was like the KFC... manager, I think, but they threw... No, that wasn't it. That was for Rivalry. That was completely different. Toddborn had a unit in it that was essentially like the police ranger or something, and they could throw chicken at their soldiers to heal them. It was sort of like Holy Light from the Paladin in Warcraft 3. It healed like 75 HP or something. And so that's pretty legit for obvious reasons. Pretty good. It costs a lot of energy, but it's pretty good. So that was something that you could do. And so I guess that was the Ackmedic. That was the original Ackmedic. All right, Lucy, I think that's an answer to your question. Hope you enjoyed. Alexhandr asks our final question. He had asked a super weapon related question some time ago, but back then the Askosi were not announced as a Cosmonarchy race. And so he wants to ask, what kind of super weapons and super units will the Askosi have? And so this is kind of nice because it brings us neatly back into Cosmonarchy. We talked about Zabalba a lot. We talked about Ackmed. Now we're talking about Cosmonarchy again. Very, very nice. Super weapons for the Askosi are definitely going to be like big tank things. Like something that I feel like the Terrans kind of don't have a lot of is tanks in general. They have the Matador and the Phalanx and eventually the Cuirass. And the Madrigal is like a hover tank. And the Claymore is a hover tank. And the Pazuzu is sort of a hover tank. But it doesn't really feel like they have a lot of tanks, actual tanks with treads and stuff like that. And so I actually really want to make the Askosi have like a bunch of tanks. I think that'll be really cool. And so them having a really big tank that when it takes fatal damage into its second phase, it deploys into this like immobile fortress that doesn't have a garrison associated with it like the Terrans do, but instead is just like, it's just got like turrets out the wazoo, dude. It's just like ready to fire at everything nearby. Sort of like, I'm almost thinking about like I think it's a Bane Blade or something like that is like one of the 40k tanks where they have like, I think they have like 5 turrets on it, like 5 machine gun turrets and like one really big turret. Something like that could be kind of interesting if it was even, I don't know how possible all the sub turrets are going to be in Cosmonarchy, but that's something that we can think about trying to achieve later for one of their super units so that they have just like a ridiculous number of attacks they can fire. And that stuff is really cool to me. Yeah, hopefully we can do something like that where it really only unlocks most of its, like it'll have like a very powerful single target attack when it's not in its, like when it's in its mobile form, although mobile is in a million air quotes because it's probably going to be something like super slow, like a Cantor level speed or something. But, thinking about what it'll turn into when it's deployed and reminding everybody again that you can have that frontline reassembly aspect where you can have units that restore the functionality of the guy that is of the vehicle that is immobilized itself. That is a thing that you can do. That's pretty sick in my opinion. So I really hope that that is something that gets you guys excited. So big Giga tank for sure. You think about super weapons that the other races have. You think about Zerg. You think about their Sovreleth and stuff like that, right? You think about the Gathalosk being a super weapon, in my opinion. The eventual Malkothrakor. Oh my God. Jakulanski's ears perked up. He couldn't believe it. When it comes to the Terrans, you think about the Diadem. You think about the Morning Star. And to some degree, the Magnetar. And then you think about like the Protoss with the Star Sovereign and, the Didact in some ways, and, shit like that, right? And the Demiurge in some ways, actually, now that it's been adjusted. So that sort of thing is really cool, in my opinion, having these like super powerful iconic units that really have a lot of, it's almost like cutscene units or like movie units, but they're real and in the game. And that's really sick. So the big tank is going to be one of them. It's probably going to be really rare to see, but I still want to put it in there. It's not exactly the first thing you'd think about for the Askosi, right? Like you'd think about, they're going to have like super mobility, and yeah, they will. And they're going to have like, some kind of air unit that is going to have a ridiculously powerful set of lightning attacks for sure. Some sort of like, lightning orb type, unit. But as far as like the things that I have concrete concepts for, the big tank is definitely one of them. I just think like there is something that screams cybernetic supremacy about having a giant tank. And so that is one of them. I should mention that their form of mind control / unit seizure, it comes from Askosi hijacking. Askosi hijacking is not what it sounds like, because they genetically become the thing they are attaching to. And so it is really, really wacky. It's not just that they like, that's probably going to be like how Protoss used to have this ability to take control of the unit without having to kill it first. The Askosi will have that ability because the hijacker is going to be consumed by the task, and they need to, stand on, like, they basically need to attach themselves to the unit. Like, they'd be like jumping up on top of like a Phobos or a Phalanx or whatever, and they genetically and like cybernetically and, nano etically become the thing they are attached to and interfacing with. And like, it's just really bizarre. And it's like the apex of their technology. And I would say that that does count as a super weapon of some kind, but the hijackers are going to be very expensive, and it's a one-way trip for them. And once you've become a ship or something, I don't really know what you are anymore. It's very wacky. So shout out to Alexhandr for your question. I hope that answered it sufficiently. That's probably the wackiest one for the Askosi. And with that, we come to the show outro. It's been another excellent time together. I love the questions. I do wish that I had been able to get this out earlier to you guys, and I do apologize about that. We will be back on the regularly scheduled programming, hopefully this coming week, where not only will we have Fraudarchy this weekend, we will also have another donator exclusive stream then, and we will, of course, be talking about this exciting time where Neblime is planned to spend some time on a beginner stream this coming Tuesday. So play your PvP games, even if you're a noob, maybe especially if you're a noob, and join us for that, where he'll be going over those games and trying to broadcast it to the CPL crowd and some other people that he knows to educate them about what Cosmonarchy is all about. I will do my best to be there as well for some or all of it, depending on how much Neblime wants to have me collaborate. But it's very exciting, and I'm very much into the idea, and I appreciate him doing that. But yeah, send us your noob games so that he can do some casting for them. And that's all I got for you. GG's, and until next time.